What to the Slave is the 4th of July, commonly referred to as the 4th of July speech, was a compelling public oration delivered by Frederick Douglass at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. The speech took place on July 5, 1852, following an invitation by the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society, and served as a commemoration of 76 years of American independence. Frederick Douglass, renowned as an American orator and statesman, utilized his eloquence and intellectual prowess to advocate for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of people of color within the United States. Douglass initiates his speech by extending his greetings to Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens. It is important to note that in this context, he is likely referring to the president of the Anti-Slavery Society, not the President of the United States. This distinction highlights Douglass's perception of himself as a citizen, equal to the individuals present in the audience. Throughout his speech and his life, Douglass tirelessly advocated for equal justice, rights, and citizenship for Black individuals. Modestly acknowledging his nervousness before the crowd, Douglass recognizes the significant journey he has undertaken since his escape from slavery. He emphasizes that the gathering is to commemorate the 4th of July, a day traditionally associated with celebration, while reminding the audience that the nation itself is still young and impressionable, capable of transformative change. Much like a young child, Douglass delves into the history of the American Revolution, where the colonists fought for their own freedom from the legal bondage imposed by British rule. He expresses his support for the actions of these revolutionaries, thereby laying the groundwork for his argument in favor of the liberation of slaves. Drawing a parallel, Douglass points out that in 1776, many regarded the act of rebelling against British tyranny as subversive and perilous. However, with the benefit of hindsight, he notes that it is now exceedingly easy to assert that America was right and England was wrong. By extension, he suggests that in the future, his anti-slavery stance will be considered patriotic, just, and reasonable. While Douglass acknowledges and respects the signers of the Declaration of Independence for their dedication to the country's welfare above their own, he clarifies that his primary intention in delivering the speech is not to merely praise and express gratitude towards these individuals. He asserts that their heroic deeds are widely known. Instead, he implores his listeners to carry forward the unfinished work of those great revolutionaries who fought to establish freedom and democracy in the land. Douglass proceeds with a compelling rhetorical question. Are the great principles of political freedom and natural justice, enshrined in that Declaration of Independence, extended to us Blacks? In doing so, he advances his thesis, boldly stating, "This 4th of July is yours, not mine." He asserts that it is an inhumane mockery and sacrilegious irony to expect a Black person to celebrate the freedom of white individuals from oppression and tyranny. By using the term sacrilegious, he highlights the desecration of the sacred American ideals of democracy, freedom, and equal rights. Acknowledging that the real focus of his speech is American slavery, Douglass condemns the nation for betraying its founding principles, both in the past and the present. He implores the audience to fulfill the aspirations of the country's founders. According to Douglass, to a slave, the 4th of July is a sham, and the proclaimed liberty is an unholy license to perpetuate the enslavement of Black individuals. He dismisses the shouts of liberty and equality as hollow mockery. In anticipation of possible counterarguments, Douglass preemptively addresses them. To those who may criticize abolitionists for consistently denouncing slavery without offering persuasive arguments, He responds by asserting that there are no more arguments to be made. He points out that no person on earth would willingly choose to become a slave themselves, which begs the question of why some advocate for imposing such a condition on others. Regarding those who argue that slavery is part of a divine plan, Douglas contends that something inhumane cannot be considered divine. He deems such a pro-slavery stance blasphemous, as it assigns cruelty a place in God's nature. Douglas vehemently condemns the profits derived from the slave trade and draws a parallel between the treatment of slaves and that of animals. He shares a chilling recollection of slave traders transporting chained individuals in the dead of night in Baltimore, under the cover of darkness to conceal the cruelty of the trade, which had become a subject of anti-slavery activism. Douglas vividly recalls how, as a child, the haunting cries of chained slaves passing his house en route to the docks in the middle of the night deeply unsettled him. Following that, Douglas proceeds to condemn the American churches and ministers, excluding abolitionist religious movements such as Garrison's, for their silence and lack of opposition to slavery. He argues that the contemporary American church, by tolerating the existence of slavery, is even more culpable than philosophers like Paine, Voltaire, or Bolingbroke, who spoke out against the churches of their time. Douglas asserts that the church is superlatively guilty because it possesses the power to eradicate slavery. By denouncing it, he deems the fugitive slave law as tyrannical legislation, since it deprives black individuals of due process and civil rights, leaving them devoid of law, justice, humanity, and religion. Under this law, even free blacks could be easily accused of being fugitive slaves and sent to the South. Douglas contends that any Christian church that allows such a law to persist is not truly a Christian church at all. Returning to the theme of American democracy and freedom, Douglas critiques the inconsistency of American ideology. While the nation professes freedom, he argues that it does not grant that right to all people. Moreover, while it advocates democracy abroad, it fails to fully extend it to its own citizens. Similarly, he points out the contradiction between the American Declaration of Independence, which proclaims that all men are created equal, and the existence of a social underclass. To counter his opponent's belief that the Constitution permits slavery, Douglas cites the writings of abolitionists Spooner, Goodell, Sewall, and Smith. These individuals' essays, according to Douglas, unequivocally vindicate the Constitution from any intention to support slavery. He aligns himself with activists who argue that the Founding Fathers intended to abolish slavery, and that the Constitution reflects this intent. In conclusion, Douglas strikes an optimistic tone. He firmly believes that the anti-slavery sentiments will eventually prevail over the pro-slavery forces. By the mid-19th century, most nations, particularly Western countries, were opposed to slavery. Slavery had already been abolished in the British colonies in 1834. And in the French colonies in 1848. Politicians in these countries could no longer claim to support human rights while condoning slavery. Douglas asserts that the cruelties of American slavery can no longer be concealed from the rest of the world due to increased trade, commerce, and the cross-pollination of political ideas across borders. He concludes his speech by sharing a poem written by Garrison, titled The Triumph of Freedom, emphasizing the inevitable triumph of freedom and the abolitionists' unwavering commitment to fight against slavery, regardless of the perils or costs involved.